Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast. As you just heard from Elizabeth, I'm Sydney Derrick, librarian at the Society. This month's episode is all about the wives of those fighting in the American Revolution, and we're calling it the Real Housewives of the Revolution. But before we get into how these women fared during the fighting, let's hear some announcements. And as a quick note, if you're listening to this episode well after it initially airs, these announcements may not be relevant anymore, but you can always check out the most current events on our website, schistory.org. An update on our hours in December. Our archives and reading room will be closed Monday, December 22nd through Friday, January 2nd, reopening with regular hours on Monday, January 5th. Our museum will be closed Wednesday and Thursday, December 24th and 25th, as well as Wednesday and Thursday, December 31st and January 1st, but will be open regular hours otherwise. Of course, you can get the latest information on closings, hours, and where to find us at our website, schistory.org. And if you haven't taken the architectural tour of our museum with our education coordinator, Melina Teston, now is the perfect time. You'll get to see the fireproof building in downtown Charleston all decked out for Christmas, thanks to the work of the Garden Club of Charleston. You can walk in the footsteps of Robert Mills, Charleston native and America's first born and trained architect, along the vaulted passageways and winding staircases of a building that has witnessed nearly 2 centuries of Charleston history. Those tours happen Fridays at 2 p.m., and you can get more information on the programs and events page of our website. Again, that's schistory.org. Because the American Revolution was being fought on American soil, the soldier's family was often involved in the war in some way too, no matter if they were Patriots or Loyalists. Sometimes this took the form of sons and fathers fighting in battles side by side or in separate areas. Sometimes this meant that wives followed their husbands and camped with them as the men fought. But it also meant that when husbands and fathers were off fighting, the women and children were home to deal with daily life, invading enemy troops, or keeping their families fed. So we're going to talk about some of those women today in our episode, Real Housewives of the Revolution. Let's get into our sources. For this episode, we used Women Patriots of the American Revolution, a Biographical Dictionary by Charles E. Claghorn, The Women of the American Revolution by Elizabeth F. Ellett, an article titled Elizabeth, Grace, and Rachel Martin, Women of the Revolution by Edward St. Germain, published on AmericanRevolution.org, an article in the Edgefield Advertiser newspaper titled An Entire Family of Patriots by Dr. Marion Bland, The Patriots at the Cowpens by Bobby Gilmer Moss, Roster of South Carolina Patriots in the American Revolution, also by Bobby Gilmer Moss, an online article, Anne Kennedy Hamilton, 2015 Hall of Fame, accessed on Anderson County Museum's website, a diary of Anne Ashby Manigault, housed in the Manigault family papers at the South Carolina Historical Society, the Desessar family papers, housed at the South Carolina Historical Society, and the pension application of Rebecca McDonald, accessed through revwarapps.org. I should also point out at the beginning of this episode that some details of these stories are not from primary sources or even contemporary sources to the time. Because the activities of women were not always recorded into official record, they weren't part of a military regiment or anything like that. These stories were often word of mouth, passed down in the family or in the town. And so, for that reason, you'll find variations on some of these stories depending on the book or website that you're reading. But the stories we're featuring here either have some kernel of firsthand account, like through the subject's own words in a pension application filed after the war, or several accounts that seem to corroborate. And for each of these women in today's episode, I'm going to do my best Real Housewives impression with a cheeky introduction before we dive deeper into her story. First up, we have Grace Waring Martin, whose Real Housewives tagline might be something like, "I may look like a lady, but my pistol says otherwise." Grace was married to William M. Martin, and they lived in Edgefield County near 96, alongside the rest of her husband's family. William's mother, Elizabeth, was a Revolution heroine in her own right, not least of which because she was storied to have strongly encouraged all of her sons who were old enough to go fight in battle for their country, and because she cared for a wounded Patriot soldier, hiding him when a band of Loyalists came to attack him. William was Elizabeth's oldest son, and he and Grace married in 1772. The Martin patriarch, Elizabeth's husband, was killed in 1773, and during the war, when her sons who were of age were out fighting, her daughters-in-law stayed at her home, located on a frequently traveled road that led to Augusta. In 1781, the women heard that a courier carrying important British messages and guarded by 2 British soldiers would soon be traveling that road near their home. So Grace and Rachel, the wife of another brother, decided that this was their time to shine. According to the story, they dressed up in their husband's clothes, grabbed a couple of pistols, and stationed themselves hidden on the side of the road, waiting for the courier. When the 3 men came by, the 2 women, disguised as soldiers and wielding guns, jumped out at them. Grace lowered her voice and demanded the papers that the courier was carrying, which he immediately handed over, very startled to be confronted. The women then hurried back home through the woods as the British were left to glumly follow the path back past the Martins' home, where they stopped, explaining what had happened and asking to stay the night there. Grace and Rachel were already back home and changed into their dresses, and so they opened their home to them, as was the polite thing to do. But while the courier and guards were dining and sleeping, a third woman married to another Martin brother, Sally, rode the message that they stole to American General Nathaniel Greene, stationed in 96 at the time. The next morning, still believing their hostesses to be kind, polite women, the courier and his guards left the Martin home, and the women had completed their mission safely. Sadly, Grace did lose her husband William during the war. He was killed at the siege of Augusta, and she was left with 2 young sons and a daughter to raise. Our next Real Housewife is Ann Kennedy Hamilton, whose tagline might sound something like, "I hear everything, and I'm about to tell all." Anne married her husband, Thomas Hamilton, in 1782, so right at the end of the war. And so a lot of the heroic acts that she performed during the war were before she was technically a housewife. And there's more than one story about Anne's bravery during the war, though some of them have been questioned over the centuries since. One story takes place when Anne is still living at her parents' home in the Union District, helping to nurse her cousin back to health after he was wounded in battle. Their home is invaded by Loyalist soldiers who steal their valuables and destroy everything else. Anne, in a burst of rage, physically throws one soldier out of the house, and then that soldier tries to throw a flaming log into the home, which she bats away, injuring herself permanently. After those Tory soldiers leave, she then helps to move her cousin, the wounded Patriot, to the woods in a shelter to protect him from another attack. But the story that's featured in Bobby Gilmer Moss's Patriots at Cowpens is my favorite because Anne may have played a big role in the American victory in that battle. Now, this is early 1781, so still before she gets married. She's still living with her parents, and in some tellings, she hears of an impending attack by the Tories. And another version, she volunteers to just be a messenger for a message that was already created by soldiers. But either way, as the story goes, she rides on her horse through swamps and near Loyalist camps to General Daniel Morgan, and she delivers a message to him. Because of this, he is prepared when a battle ensues on January 17th, 1781. In John Buchanan's book, The Road to Guilford Courthouse, which discusses the lead up to the Battle of Cowpens, no mention of Anne Kennedy is made. However, the book does discuss intelligence that General Morgan had men stationed to watch for Tarleton's movements, so perhaps Anne carried a message from one of these lookouts. The Battle of Cowpens was an important win for the Americans, with 86% of the British brigades suffering casualties, and a much smaller number on the Patriots side. After Anne married Thomas Hamilton, they made a home in Pendleton and were some of the founders of the Carmel Presbyterian Church there. Rebecca MacDonald is our next story, and her tagline might be something like, "My husband may be in prison, but I go wherever I want." Rebecca was married to Hugh MacDonald, and they lived in the Fairfield district. This story is interesting because we have it in her own words. She files a pension application in 1841 to receive her husband's pension from his service in the war, and in it, she tells this story. Her husband, Hugh, had already served some before their marriage in 1778, but about a year after their wedding, he volunteers again for a company in Thomas Sumter's regiment. During the Battle of Camden, Hugh was captured and put in prison, eventually being placed on a prison ship in the Charleston harbor. Rebecca traveled there to visit her husband, and when many of the soldiers were moved into barracks on land because of illness, she followed them there too. She helped to nurse her husband and his fellow soldiers back to health. And then they were all sent back to the ship. Again, Rebecca followed her husband back to the ship and was with him when that ship actually left the harbor and carried the soldiers to Jamestown, Virginia, where they were exchanged for British prisoners of war who had been captured by the Americans. So at this point, Hugh was free. He was no longer a prisoner, but both he and Rebecca were 500 miles from home with no food, horses, or any other way to get back. On top of that, Hugh was again ill after his release from prison. Somehow, though, they managed to travel the distance back home over the next several months. Now, I should be clear here that Rebecca does not specifically say in her pension application how they got home, although some stories say they walked that entire distance. Rebecca does say, though, that Hugh was exchanged in 1780, and they did not arrive home to Fairfield District until May of 1781. So quite the journey that Rebecca accompanied her husband on. Anne Ashby Manigault was born into one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina and married Gabriel Manigault in 1730. She is our next story, and I'd imagine her Real Housewives tagline would be, "I'm always watching and always writing." She kept a diary of daily life and social engagements, as well as births, marriages, deaths in her community from 1754 to 1781. And although some of the entries were pretty bland, like simple recordings of those marriages and deaths, Anne also wrote about the anxiety of that time leading up to the British seizure of the city of Charleston. In May of 1779, she wrote, quote, "May 4th, great uneasiness on account of the British troops. 9th, great confusion, as they were very near. 10, they were in sight of Charlestown. 11th, much firing, and it was expected the town would be attacked. Benjamin Huger killed by our own people by mistake. 12th, many flags sent into town. They marched off in the night. 13th, pretty quiet in the night, but they are very troublesome in the country. 15th, we hear nothing of them. 16th, we are still very uneasy. They are ravaging the country. 17th to 21st, the same, and General Lincoln cannot prevent it. 22nd, some of our people went to Johnson's fort, were fired upon, and a good many wounded. 23rd, Count Pulaski had a skirmish with them. By February of 1780, people around Anne were taking action because of the British, and you can hear the fear and hopelessness in her writing. February 13, Mr. William Gibbs dined here. We are much afraid of the British who are on John's Island. 15, people go out of town very fast. 16, Mrs. Ragg and my granddaughter A went today. 17, my 2 grandsons went to Goose Creek. 23, the British upon James Island. 26, people are very much distressed. The British are trying to repair Johnson's fort. 28, our frigates fired on them all day, but to little purpose. Despite Anne's concerns about the British Army in Charleston, Gabriel took an oath of loyalty to the king once the British took control of Charleston in 1780. The Manigos then left the city, retiring to their plantation in Goose Creek. Gabriel died in 1781, and Anne died in April of 1782, just months before the British retreated from her city. Mary Desessor, our last story, was another wealthy housewife in Charleston during the war, and her tagline might be, "I'm moving up and moving on, leaving the drama down here in the South." Mary Desessor's husband, Daniel, was imprisoned when the British took control of Charleston in 1780. He was first transported to St. Augustine before being exchanged for British prisoners of war and then ordered to Philadelphia, along with his wife and children. But by this time, the British had seized the property of most of the prominent patriots, so Mary had no money to get herself and their many children to safety in Philadelphia, as she was ordered to do. To pay for the trip, she wrote to Lieutenant Colonel Nisbet Balfour and the Board of Police, which was the British governing body in Charleston at the time, because they were back under British rule. In her petition, she requested permission to sell her own furniture to fund the trip. Mary emphasizes that her husband had no debt and asks the Board of Police to, quote, grant her the indulgence of making sale of the furniture belonging to her dwelling house and kitchen, also a riding chaise, end quote. She was granted that request and was able to arrive in Philadelphia along with other Charleston families of men who were exchanged there on August 3rd, 1781. And their son, Henry William Desessor, will later serve as a delegate to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention in 1790. Those are the stories of just a handful of women here in South Carolina during the American Revolution. We've discussed others in past episodes. The Loyalist wife Sarah Stewart, who was imprisoned by the Patriots in her home, Elizabeth Simpson, who was married to a backcountry Loyalist and had to testify before the Council of Safety about her husband's conversations, and Susanna Smith Elliott Carnes, who created flags to celebrate the victory of American soldiers that those soldiers protected with their lives. And all of these stories are just the ones that were recorded. Many people living during that time had no means of writing their experiences down for posterity, but they would have experienced the hardships of war all the same. That's going to do it for this month's episode. We'll see you back here on the second Monday in January with a new one. Thanks so much for joining us.